I still remember the exact sound that locked type drawer made when my half-brother tossed it into the dumpster behind the studio. A hollow, wooden clatter, like a coffin lid dropping shut. Inside that drawer, buried beneath 40 pounds of vintage Gothic wood type, was the original notarized partnership agreement he swore he had already shredded. And that single sheet of 100-pound cotton paper would eventually undo a $620,000 sale, put my brother in a federal courtroom with a fraud docket number that now gets printed on every single greeting card we sell, and leave him setting type every morning in an apron I had custom embroidered with 2 words, pressed lies. I am not a vengeful person by nature. I was a 47-year-old widow who had spent 11 years directing activities at a memory care nursing home, where the most dramatic event of my day was usually convincing Mr. Delgado that the sing-along wasn't a conspiracy. I once spent an entire afternoon helping a resident named Edith relearn how to hold a paintbrush after a stroke, guiding her fingers around the handle, and watching her face light up when the first stroke of blue hit the paper. That patience, the slow rebuilding of something that had been taken away, would become the spine of everything that followed. My husband, Paul, was a lineman with a rural utility co-op. He had hands the size of dinner plates and a laugh that sounded like gravel tumbling downhill. On a rainy Sunday years before the studio existed, he had handed me a tension wrench and a hook pick, opened an old warded lock he'd salvaged from a flea market, and taught me to feel the tiny clicks of each ward lifting. "You don't force it," he said. "You just listen with your fingers." He worked storm duty for 22 years until a wet branch and a snapped pole took him from me on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday in April. The life insurance payout was $99,000, all of it deposited into our joint credit union account exactly 14 days after the funeral. Paul left no children, no debts, and exactly one piece of advice he had repeated so often it became background noise. Don't ever let your brother-in-law near anything with a signature line. My half-brother, Scott, was my mother's golden child from her second marriage, the kind of man who could sell sand to a desert and yet still somehow end up overdrawn on his checking account. He had a smile that made people trust him instantly and a track record of failed ventures that would have bankrupted anyone with less charisma. When I told him I wanted to use Paul's inheritance to open a letterpress studio, he appeared on my doorstep the next morning with a detailed business plan printed on heavy cream stock, a list of antique equipment auctions, and a hug that felt just convincing enough to ignore the warning Paul had left behind. For 18 months, that studio worked. We found a drafty brick storefront in a gentrifying neighborhood of Columbus, Ohio, and I poured every remaining dollar into it. Scott handled the branding and the client meetings. I handled the presses. A Vandercook SB-15 that needed its rollers rebuilt, a C&P pilot that had been rusting in a barn for 40 years, and a collection of rare wood type I had personally cataloged, cleaned with mineral spirits, and stored in those heavy oak type drawers Paul had salvaged from a shuttered newspaper before we even met. I loved the smell of the ink, that sharp, oily sweetness that clung to my clothes and my hair, and the quiet meditation of setting each letter by hand, locking up a form and pulling the first proof. That keyboard layout, that rhythm of feeding the press, those quiet hours of setting 6-line Newland by hand, they rebuilt something inside me that Paul's death had shattered. I thought Scott understood that. I thought the notarized 50-50 partnership agreement we signed together, right there on the Vandercook's feed board, meant something. 17 months after we opened, a high-end stationery brand called Larkspur & Quill reached out. Their buyer had seen samples of our work at a trade show, the deep impression on thick cotton stock, the old wood type with its nicks and character. They wanted our entire collection. The presses, the wood type, the composing sticks, the quoins, every last reglet and leading slug. Their offer was $620,000, wired into escrow upon execution of a bill of sale. Scott told me the news with tears in his eyes. He said it was our retirement, my security, everything Paul would have wanted for me. I cried too. I believed him. 4 days later, the studio stood empty. I walked in that morning and the silence hit me like a physical blow. The presses were gone, the type cabinets bare, the ink slab cleaned and wrapped in plastic. The only thing left was a faint ghost of solvent in the air. Scott handed me a white envelope. Inside was a voucher for a local art supply store, made out in my name, for $3,800, with the word ink handwritten in the memo line. He explained that the deal had been renegotiated. The buyer had discovered some condition issues with the pilot press. The final amount had been reduced dramatically, and after paying off overdue operating expenses I had never known existed, my share was, well, the ink voucher. He said it with such practiced sympathy that for a full 15 seconds I simply stood there in that gutted room, staring at the empty space where my presses had been, unable to form a single word. The vultures circled that same evening. Scott's wife, Margaret, arrived uninvited, wearing a cream-colored blazer that cost more than my monthly mortgage, and carrying a leather folio stuffed with documents she wanted me to sign to close the books cleanly. A general release, a quitclaim on the business entity, a ratification of the bill of sale. She kept patting my hand and saying things like, "We're doing this for you, and you don't need the stress of legal loose ends." Scott hovered behind her, nodding, his phone buzzing every 3 minutes. They were there to manage me, not mourn with me. The whole performance lasted an hour before I told them I had a migraine and needed to lie down. They left the documents on the kitchen counter with a sticky note that said, "By Friday, please." The next morning they came back with a rented dumpster and began clearing out the remaining debris from the studio, the scraps of paper and broken pallets and old ink cans. I stood at the back door of the building, watching them haul things out, my stomach a tight knot. That was when I saw Scott carry out one of Paul's old type drawers, the one with the ornate brass card holder and the little locking mechanism Paul had installed himself. I had never been able to find the key after Paul died. It had sat in the studio as a sentimental piece, never opened, just a heavy wooden box with secrets I assumed were only old letters. Scott held it up, shook it so the wood type inside rattled, and said to Margaret, "Old junk, nothing worth keeping." He walked it straight to the dumpster and dropped it on top of a broken pallet. I waited until they drove away for lunch. Then I walked out to that dumpster, my heart pounding against my ribs, and I leaned over the edge and pulled that drawer out. It was heavy, the wood rough against my palms, and it smelled faintly of mineral spirits and the dust of 100 years. I carried it into my garage like I was carrying a child, and I set it on Paul's old workbench, next to his jars of sordid screws and the coffee can of lineman's grease. The lock was a simple warded mechanism, the kind used on antique furniture, with a small brass escutcheon plate slightly tarnished. Paul had taught me to pick warded locks on that rainy Sunday afternoon. I took a bobby pin and bent the end into a tiny hook, and I grabbed a thin pocket screwdriver from the junk drawer for tension tool. I inserted the screwdriver into the bottom of the keyhole and applied a slight turning pressure, then slid the bobby pin in above it, fishing for the ward. I could feel the resistance of each small metal obstruction, and I pressed upward one at a time, listening with my fingers just the way Paul had shown me. The first ward gave with a tiny scrape. The second clicked. On the third, I felt the plug rotate a millimeter. 40 seconds total, and the drawer slid open with a sigh of old wood. Inside, beneath layers of wood type that spelled out fragments of old headlines, I found a manila envelope sealed with wax. Not red wax, but the plain brown adhesive tape wax Paul used for weatherproofing his outdoor tools. I opened it carefully, the paper cracking at the edges. The first thing I saw was the original partnership agreement, the one Scott and I had signed together. Not a copy, the original. The notary stamp was crisp, the signatures dry and dark, my own looping Dana Ellis next to Scott's sharp, angular scrawl. The second thing I saw was a single sheet of Paul's handwriting, the blocky all-caps script he used when he was wiring an electrical panel. It read, "Dana, if you are reading this, I was right. Do not trust your brother. This drawer holds the truth. There is a second copy with my own lawyer, but you have to be the one to find it. Save yourself. I love you. Paul." I stood in that cold garage with motor oil under my fingernails and a dead man's warning in my hands, and I felt the floor of my world tilt 20 degrees. Paul had known. He had seen Scott's soul years before I ever did, and he had left me a weapon disguised as junk. The original agreement was not just a piece of paper. It contained a clause that Paul himself had insisted I include, back when we had first discussed the business over the kitchen table, a clause I had almost forgotten because Scott had assured me it was just boilerplate. The clause, typed in the precise language of an estate attorney, stated that any sale, transfer, or encumbrance of partnership assets exceeding $10,000 required the notarized signature of both partners, executed in person within the same state, with original ink signatures, and that any transaction consummated without both such signatures would be void ab initio, void from the beginning, as if it never happened. Scott had forged my signature on the bill of sale. I knew that now. And that clause meant the entire $620,000 transaction was a legal nullity. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that a signature forged with greed always reveals itself. I didn't call the police. I didn't confront Scott. I didn't even call Paul's lawyer, an old estate attorney named Frank Belknap, whose number was still in my phone. I understood instinctively that if Scott sensed I knew anything, he would destroy every piece of evidence he could reach. So I played weak. I played foggy. I called him that evening and told him my migraine had gotten worse, that I was having trouble remembering simple things, that the stress was making me feel confused. I deliberately slurred my speech just slightly, letting my voice trail off at the ends of sentences. Scott's tone on the phone shifted instantly from guarded to relieved, and he said the words I needed to hear. "Margaret and I think you should come stay with us for a while, just until you're steadier. We can take care of you." I let them move me into their guest bedroom that weekend, a pristine beige room in a house I later learned Scott had bought with a large cash down payment 4 days after the sale closed. The room smelled like lavender air freshener and new carpet, and the walls were decorated with generic watercolor prints of flowers. I brought one small suitcase and the type drawer, which I hid under the guest bed inside an old blanket, pressing it flat against the carpet so the bedskirt hid the edge. I told them I just wanted to feel safe. Margaret patted my hand again. Scott poured me chamomile tea in a delicate porcelain cup. They thought they were controlling me. They were wrong. My investigation began the first time they left me alone. I had always been the kind of person who could fix things the world assumed were broken beyond repair, not because I was some savant, but because I had spent decades in a nursing home where the budget was paper-thin and the maintenance men were always understaffed. I could replace the rollers on a Vandercook, rebuild a dishwasher pump, patch drywall, pick a simple lock, and read a financial statement with the same meticulous attention I had once used to balance a recreation budget of $1,200 a month. During my first week in Scott's house, I began to notice the shape of their life, the frantic edges beneath the polished surface. The first red flag was the phone calls. Scott would step into his home office, close the heavy pocket door, and his voice would rise and fall in frantic patterns I could just barely make out through the heating vent in my bathroom. I would sit on the tile floor with my ear against the metal grill, breathing quietly, and I heard fragments. "No, the escrow officer keeps asking for the original partner. I told you I can't get her to sign if she's like this." Another call, a few days later. "The compliance department flagged the signature. I need you to push that verification through." Then, after a long pause, his voice tight with panic. "What do you mean the funds are frozen? I already spent half the disbursement." I cataloged each fragment. The word compliance repeated like a drumbeat. The second red flag was the spending. They tried to hide it, but I had eyes that missed nothing. Scott replaced his perfectly functional sedan with a brand new German SUV, the kind that smelled of rich leather and engine heat, and he parked it conspicuously in the driveway instead of the garage. Margaret came home with shopping bags from stores that didn't put prices on their items, tissue paper spilling out. They ate dinner at restaurants where the entrees didn't have numbers, and they talked about a consulting retainer Scott had landed. A story that fell apart the moment I casually asked what kind of consulting, and Scott answered business development with his eyes on the floor and a too-quick sip of wine. One evening at dinner, I played my role of the confused older sister and asked, innocently, "Scott, who is your main client for the consulting work? I'd love to send a thank you note for letting me stay here." He froze, fork halfway to his mouth, and Margaret jumped in with, "Oh, it's all confidential, you know, NDA," and changed the subject to the weather. That night I lay awake and added another puzzle piece. The consulting retainer didn't exist. The third red flag was physical evidence. The guest bathroom had a leaky faucet, a slow, persistent drip that Scott and Margaret had apparently ignored for weeks because the plumber was too booked. I offered to fix it, telling Margaret I needed something to focus my mind, something small and mechanical. She looked at me with the patronizing pity of someone who had never held a wrench and said, "Oh, sweetie, we'll call a plumber. You just rest." I fixed it anyway the next afternoon while she was out, using Paul's old Leatherman and a spare O-ring I found in a dusty organizer in the garage, right next to a coffee can of lineman's grease that still had Paul's handwriting on the lid. I shut off the water under the sink, disassembled the cartridge with a few careful turns, and replaced the worn O-ring that had flattened into an oval. When I turned the water back on, the drip was gone. That small act of competence told me exactly how little they understood about me. And while I was under the sink, wiping the pipe connections with an old rag, I noticed the baseboard behind the vanity was slightly loose, a gap just wide enough to fit a finger. I waited until 3 in the morning, when the house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. Using a penlight and the patience of a woman who had spent years coaxing agitated dementia patients into calm, I wiggled that baseboard free. Behind it was a thick file folder stuffed with documents, crammed into the wall cavity. I extracted it carefully, my heart thumping, and spread the contents on the bathroom floor. Inside were the shredded remains of documents Scott had evidently tried to destroy, then hidden rather than properly disposed of. The pieces were cross-cut, each strip about 1/8 of an inch wide and 2 inches long, and the pile looked like pale confetti. But I was an expert at puzzles. I spent 3 nights on that cold tile floor, sorting the strips by color and paper weight, aligning the edges, reconstructing pages with Scotch tape, and a pair of tweezers from the medicine cabinet. It was slow, painstaking work that made my eyes ache and my back stiff, but piece by piece, the picture emerged. What I uncovered was a portrait of a man in financial freefall. Scott had taken out a predatory business loan 3 months before the Larkspur and Quill offer, a high-interest line of credit with a personal guarantee that listed my forged signature as co-signer. The interest rate was 24%, and it had ballooned. He had an offshore shell company registered in Nevis, a tiny island I'd never heard of, with account statements showing transfers I couldn't yet trace. There were collection notices from vendors we had apparently never paid, a pending lawsuit from a former business partner in a defunct CBD venture, and a credit card balance that would have paid my mortgage for 3 years. The bill of sale for the studio assets was in the file too, a 10-page document with my supposed signature on page 7. When I held it next to the real partnership agreement under a magnifying glass from the desk in the hallway, I could see the differences clearly. The pen pressure was unnaturally uniform, the loops of the A in my name slightly too round, the exit stroke of the final S, missing the tiny upward flick I always made unconsciously. A forensic document examiner would have confirmed it in minutes. Scott had not just forged my signature, he had traced it. I began to realize the full scope of his plan. Scott hadn't just stolen my inheritance. He had structured the sale so that I would appear to be the responsible party for tax liabilities, with a fraudulent Form W-9 listing my social security number as the primary seller. He was setting me up as the legal scapegoat for a capital gains tax bill that would exceed $200,000, while the actual proceeds vanished into his offshore account. If I had signed Margot's release, I would have been legally accepting that tax burden. It was a plan so cruel, so calculated, that I felt physically ill, my stomach churning as I sat on that bathroom floor with the reconstructed documents spread around me like evidence at a crime scene. The discovery that changed everything came on the 7th night. The bathroom file contained a reference to a separate locked filing cabinet in Scott's office, a large metal cabinet with a high-security Medico lock that he kept behind his desk. I knew a Medico was far beyond my amateur lockpicking skill, but I remembered something else Paul had taught me. The cheapest way into a locked filing cabinet is often through the back. I waited until a weekday morning when Scott and Margot left for what they said was a legal appointment, and I slipped into the office, my socked feet silent on the hardwood. The cabinet was heavy, jammed against the wall, but with a pry bar from the garage and a folded towel to muffle sound, I tipped it forward just enough to access the rear panel. 4 Phillips head screws held a thin metal plate covering the lock mechanism. I removed them with my Leatherman, the driver bit fitting perfectly, and I reached inside with my fingers, feeling for the locking bar. It was a simple vertical rod that slid up and down when the key turned, and I lifted it manually out of its track. The drawers opened with a heavy, smooth glide. Inside, I found the smoking gun. A scanned copy of the bill of sale with a sticky note attached, in Scott's unmistakable handwriting, that read, "D's sig needs to match exactly the partnership ref. Use the old Xmas card for practice." Stapled to that was a photocopy of a Christmas card I had sent him 4 years earlier, a simple card with a watercolor pine tree on the front, my signature isolated and circled in red ink. He had traced it. He had literally traced my signature, practicing over and over on a light box until the lines were muscle memory. The arrogance of keeping that evidence, even in a locked cabinet, told me Scott believed he was untouchable. That folder also contained something I hadn't expected. A letter from the escrow company handling the Larkspur and Quill sale, stamped with an orange compliance hold banner across the top. The letter was addressed to Scott and Margaret, and it stated that a condition of the fund's release required notarized original signatures from both partners, and that the buyers had flagged a discrepancy with the signing date and requested additional identity verification. The money had not actually been fully released yet. $400,000 was still sitting in escrow, frozen, because the escrow officer, a woman named Ruth Nakamura, had noticed that my signature on the bill of sale looked too perfect, too traced, and she had filed an internal fraud alert under the bank's anti-money laundering protocols. The letter concluded with a firm directive. The escrow agent would not release the remaining funds without a live, in-person verification of identity and signature from the named partner, Dana Ellis. Scott had been writing frantic responses, drafts I found stuffed in the back of the drawer, begging for extensions and claiming I was medically incapacitated. But the bank had not budged. I read that letter 3 times, and a wild, dangerous hope kindled in my chest. Scott's desperation, the frozen funds, the compliance hold, it was all a trap already set, and I was the trigger. I placed a call to Frank Belknap the next morning from the parking lot of a grocery store 3 miles away, using a prepaid phone I bought with cash at a gas station. I sat in my car with the engine off, the windows fogging in the cold, and I told him everything in a low, urgent voice. He listened in silence for a long moment after I finished, then said, "Dana, your husband left a file with me 5 years ago." I've been waiting for this call. Paul had suspected Scott would try something, not about the studio specifically because it didn't exist yet, but about any financial arrangement I might make. He had instructed Frank to keep a notarized copy of any partnership agreement. I signed the moment it was executed, along with a pre-signed affidavit from me authorizing Frank to act on my behalf if I ever became incapacitated or unduly influenced. The dead man's switch was already in place. Paul had also, without ever telling me, written a sealed letter to the bank's compliance officer, Ruth Nakamura herself, identifying Scott as a potential financial predator and requesting extra scrutiny on any transaction bearing my name. The escrow hold was not an accident. It was a tripwire Paul had set before he died. Frank conferenced in Ruth Nakamura on the call. Her voice was calm and precise, with the measured cadence of someone who had spent decades untangling fraud. She explained the mechanics. The escrow agreement contained a forced pairing clause that required me to physically appear at a designated bank branch and provide a wet ink signature, with a government-issued ID, before the remaining funds could be released to any party. If Scott could not produce me, the transaction would unwind, the assets would revert to the original owners, and the already disbursed $220,000 would become a liability for the buyer's title insurance company, which would then pursue Scott for recovery under a fraud claim. The bank's internal anti-money laundering team had already flagged the transaction, and an FBI special agent named Morrison had been assigned to monitor the case, waiting for me to surface. Ruth said, "MS. Ellis, if you are willing to cooperate, we can set a trap. But you'll need to gather one final piece of evidence, the original bill of sale from Scott's possession, with his fingerprints on it, so we can prove he fabricated it." I told her I already had it. I had photographed every page, and I could produce the document itself from the filing cabinet. 2 days later, I met Frank at a diner off the interstate, a greasy spoon with cracked vinyl booths, where no one would look twice at a middle-aged woman and an old lawyer. He slid a manila envelope across the table. Inside was the neurologist's letter, obtained that morning after a full cognitive evaluation at a clinic I had visited under the guise of following up on my dizzy spells. The letter, signed and notarized, stated I was fully competent and had no evidence of cognitive impairment, that I had been the victim of attempted undue influence. It was a preemptive strike against the dementia defense Scott would inevitably try. Frank also handed me a small digital audio recorder, no bigger than a pack of gum, and showed me how to activate it with a single press through the fabric of my pocket. "When the moment comes," he said, "you won't need it for court, but it'll feel good to have your own record. A woman's voice is too often erased." The maximum cruelty beat arrived the next afternoon, and I engineered it myself. I needed to know whether any sliver of human decency existed in the brother I had once loved. So I decided to fake a transient ischemic attack, a ministroke. I researched the symptoms carefully: sudden unilateral weakness, facial droop, slurred speech, confusion, no loss of consciousness. I practiced in the bathroom mirror, letting the left side of my face go slack, my eyelid drooping, my mouth pulling to one side. I rehearsed the fall, a slow crumple against the wall, my hand clawing weakly at the doorframe. At precisely 2:15 p.m., while Scott and Margaret were both home, I let myself collapse in the hallway outside the kitchen. I heard my own body hit the floor with a soft thud, the air leaving my lungs. I let my breathing become shallow, one arm bent awkwardly beneath me, the left side of my face slack. I heard Margaret's footsteps first, the click of her heels on the hardwood, then a sharp intake of breath. Then Scott's footsteps, slower, heavier. He stepped over me. I felt the displacement of air as his leg passed over my torso, and I heard him walk into the guest room. The mattress springs creaked as he tore the bedclothes off, searching for something. His voice was low and angry. "Where is it? Where is the release form? Margaret, check her suitcase, check the closet. I need her signature on that form before we call anyone." Margaret hesitated, her voice quivering. "Scott, she's not moving, shouldn't we?" And Scott snapped, "Make it look real. Call 911 after I find it. The document first." I lay on that hallway floor, my face pressed against the cool wood, and I felt the last tiny thread of family loyalty inside me sever like a dry twig. Margaret did dial 911, but only after Scott had ransacked my room and found nothing, the release form still safe in my bra inside a sealed plastic bag. Paramedics arrived within minutes. I let them examine me, playing the role of a confused, frightened woman, answering their questions with halting, slurred words until they gently lifted me onto a gurney. Scott appeared at my side then, his face a mask of concern, his hand patting my shoulder, and he said to the paramedics, "She's been under so much stress. We've been so worried about her." The performance was so flawless I almost admired it. At the hospital, after tests showed no acute stroke, they recommended a follow-up with a neurologist and sent me home with a pamphlet on transient ischemic attacks. I thanked everyone, and I filed the memory of my brother stepping over my body into a permanent, locked drawer in my mind, right next to Paul's warning. That night, I called Ruth Nakamura from the guest bathroom with the water running to mask my voice. I told her I was ready. We set the date and location. The escrow bank's main branch in downtown Columbus, 4 days later, at 10 in the morning. Ruth would have the compliance team and Special Agent Morrison in the conference room. Frank would be there with the neurologist's letter and my affidavit. All I had to do was show up, refuse to sign, and speak the words that would trigger the cascade. The confrontation happened on a bright, cold Thursday morning. Scott and Margaret had told me we were going to finalize some paperwork so the business could be properly closed. They dressed me in a soft gray cardigan and flat shoes, like a child being taken to a doctor's appointment. Margaret smoothed my hair with a brush that felt like condescension, and Scott carried the leather folio with his forged documents. The drive into the city was silent, except for the hum of the new SUV's engine, Scott's knuckles white on the steering wheel. Margaret kept her hand on my elbow as we walked through the revolving door, up the elevator with its polished brass panels, and into a conference room on the 7th floor. The room had a long oak table, a large window overlooking the Scioto River, and a bank of fluorescent lights that hummed softly. Ruth Nakamura was already seated at the head of the table, a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and a no-nonsense suit. 2 men in dark suits sat beside her, one from the bank's fraud division, the other FBI Special Agent Morrison, a broad-shouldered man with a calm, watchful expression. Frank Belknap sat against the wall in a leather chair, his briefcase on his lap. I had not told Scott any of them would be there. Scott's face paled the moment he saw the room, but he was a performer, and he recovered quickly. He launched into a smooth speech about resolving outstanding administrative matters and slid a document across the table, a final release that would have signed away my last legal rights. Margaret handed me a pen, a heavy fountain pen that Scott had bought specifically for the occasion because its ink would flow smoothly and look authoritative. I could smell the metallic tang of the nib, the faint chemical scent of the ink. I looked at the pen. I looked at my brother, at the faint sheen of sweat on his forehead, at the way his eyes darted to the far corner of the room. And I said in a voice that was perfectly steady, the voice of a woman who had picked a lock, repaired a faucet, reconstructed shredded documents, and listened to her dead husband's warning from beyond the grave. No, I will not sign a document that ratifies a forgery, Scott. And I believe Special Agent Morrison would like to ask you about the traced signature you practiced from my Christmas card. The room erupted into controlled chaos. Scott lunged for the folio, but Agent Morrison already had a hand on his wrist. Margaret began shouting about lawyers, her cream blazer bunching around her shoulders as she waved her arms, her voice rising into a shriek. Ruth Nakamura opened her laptop and read aloud the compliance hold notice, her voice carrying over the noise, while Morrison recited the federal fraud statutes Scott had violated. Wire fraud under 18 U.S.C. 1343, identity theft under 18 U.S.C. 1028, forgery, money laundering, and tax evasion. I watched my brother's face crumble from arrogance to confusion to cold, animal panic. He tried one more lie, his voice cracking. She's mentally incompetent. She has dementia. She doesn't know what she's saying. She had a stroke last week, for God's sake. Frank Belknap stood up, walked to the table, and slid the notarized neurologist's letter across the polished wood, the seal catching the light. My client, Frank said, is fully competent and has been the victim of systematic fraud and attempted undue influence. The court will see the evidence. The trap snapped shut with a finality that echoed in the quiet that followed. Scott and Margaret were arrested in that conference room, her blazer still rumpled, his tie askew. The remaining $400,000 in escrow was frozen permanently, then returned to Larkspur and Quill, who promptly sued Scott for the $220,000 already disbursed plus legal fees and reputational damages. The buyer's title insurance covered the loss and then pursued Scott personally, attaching liens to his house, his new SUV, and every asset Margaret had acquired with the stolen money. The original sale was voided completely. The presses, the wood type, the composing sticks, every last piece of equipment that had been loaded onto a freight truck were returned to me by court order, because Paul's partnership clause had made the bill of sale void ab initio. It was as if the sale had never happened. Scott's trial was brutal and brief. He was convicted on 7 felony counts, and at my victim impact statement, I stood in that courtroom and held up the original partnership agreement, the notary stamp visible to the judge. I said, "My husband left me this, and it saved me. I only wish he could see it." I didn't cry until I sat back down. His fraud docket number became a matter of public record, printed on every document associated with his case. He served 22 months in federal prison, and as part of his restitution agreement, he was ordered to perform 500 hours of community service, with the court specifying that the service should be meaningful and related to the harm caused. I petitioned the court to allow that service to be completed under my supervision at the studio. I argued that setting type by hand, cleaning presses, and understanding the integrity of the printed word would be rehabilitative. The judge, a woman who had once taken a letterpress workshop in college, agreed. I renamed the business impression of Deceit Press. We still operate out of the same brick storefront, and the Vandercook SB-15 still runs like a dream, its rollers freshly rebuilt, its ink slab gleaming. I do custom letterpress work now, wedding invitations, broadsides, limited edition poetry chapbooks, but our signature line is a set of greeting cards I designed myself. Each one is printed on heavy 100-pound cotton stock, the impression deep enough to feel with your eyes closed. On the back, there is a blind deboss of the original partnership clause, the words pressed into the paper without ink so you can trace the letters with your fingertips. The front is clean, with a simple message in 6-line Newland, that old Gothic wood type Paul and I once cleaned with mineral spirits on a Sunday afternoon. Nothing forged lasts. And inside every card, hidden in the decal edge, there is a tiny, impressed set of numbers, a watermark embedded in the paper fibers during the making. It is Scott's federal fraud docket number, visible only if you hold the card up to the light. I don't point it out to customers. They just think it's a subtle design choice, a quirk of the handmade process. But I know, and Scott knows, that every piece of paper that leaves this shop is a monument to the truth Paul left me in a locked drawer and a single line of handwriting. Save yourself. Scott reports to the studio every Tuesday and Thursday at 8 a.m., without fail. He sets type, his fingers now stained with ink. He cleans the presses, wiping the rollers with solvent and a rag, the same kind of clumsy care he once mocked. He sweeps the floors, the bristles of the broom scratching against the old brick. He wears a canvas apron I had made by a local seamstress, dark gray with white block letters across the chest that read "Pressed Lies." There is a small pocket on the front where he keeps his composing stick. I don't speak to him except to give instructions, and he doesn't speak to me at all. But every morning when I unlock the studio door and flick on the lights, I see him there, already at work, and I feel the particular, earned warmth of a woman who learned that integrity is not something you inherit. It is something you print, letter by letter, with your own hands. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? Tell me in the comments. If this story meant something to you, please like and subscribe and help me keep this press running for those who believe that the truth, once said in type, can never be unsaid. This is Impression of Deceit Press, and the only thing we press harder than ink is the truth.